Sandra Dee was brought to the screen when she was far too young, with a crystal-clear face, innocent eyes, and a smile that made all of America believe she was the perfect embodiment of the good girl. In just a few short years, Sandra Dee became Hollywood's biggest teenage icon of the late 1950s. Her name appeared on movie posters, magazine covers, and in the pure, idealized dreams the public wanted to believe were real. But behind that polished, seemingly perfect image was a very different reality, a reality shaped, controlled, and sometimes broken by the very industry that celebrated her. Sandra's childhood had been stolen quietly, almost invisibly. Born Alexandra Zuck in 1942 in Beyond, New Jersey, she grew up in a family that quickly fell apart. Her parents divorced when she was still very young, and her world shrank to revolve entirely around her mother, Mary Zuck. Decisions were rarely discussed, they were made, and Sandra obeyed. Obedience became instinctive, a habit formed before she even realized she might have had the right to choose differently. Money, schedules, meals, and even the simplest daily choices were all controlled by her mother. From an early age, Sandra learned that her worth was measured by contracts and paychecks, not by her own desires or choices. By the time she was 4 or 5, work began filling the hours that should have belonged to play. She would stand in front of the camera, holding a perfect smile until adults were satisfied, standing still as her dress was adjusted just right, moving from one shoot to the next. Days ended in hotel rooms, not with friends or games, but with tutoring sessions and preparation for the next day's work. And while income flowed steadily, it came without choice. Sandra did what she was told, and praise came only for correctness. The abuse she suffered at the hands of her stepfather existed in the same silence that allowed her career to continue. It was quiet, never spoken aloud, carefully compartmentalized so daytime work could proceed uninterrupted. Her body, even then, was closely monitored. Camera angles were chosen, lighting adjusted, dresses tightened, all to preserve a delicate fragility that the public would learn to associate with her innocence. From the earliest age, Sandra's body became part of a frame, not entirely her own. By the early 1950s, New York was already familiar with Sandra Dee, the blonde-haired, slender girl who appeared regularly in advertising spreads. Modeling turned into a career, and by 1956, before she had even entered her teens, her income had already reached $75,000, a staggering sum that stripped her of the ability to slow down. Professional school existed only to fit around contracts, not to teach children normal academic or social skills. Classes were interrupted for shoots, tutors came to the set, and flexibility replaced the idea of a traditional education. Childhood friendships were fleeting, built on the shifting schedules of work rather than shared lives. Normalcy, for Sandra, became a concept defined entirely by the machine of her career. Eating became another site of control. Weight and appearance were constantly monitored, meals reduced or skipped entirely. Maintaining her body became the last domain over which she could exert some control, but even that was tied to survival in the machine, not freedom. Hunger became obedience. Discipline became self-punishment. Survival meant shrinking oneself into the narrow frame that the industry demanded. By 1957, Hollywood had noticed. Until They Sail carried her from modeling into feature films, and she quickly proved she could be used long-term, a face soft enough to adapt, pure enough to disturb no one, and young enough to promise years of profitable work. The Golden Globe for New Star of the Year followed that same year, cementing her reputation as a wholesome, safe version of Shirley Temple grown up. Universal signed her to a contract, not just for work, but to manage an entire persona. Every move, appearance, and hairstyle was curated to maintain a carefully constructed identity. Growing up, for Sandra, was no longer a natural process, it was a variable to be contained, a feeling to be preserved for the audience. By 1959, with Imitation of Life, Sandra Dee had reached the height of cultural recognition. The film grossed over $50 million, and her face became inseparable from the purity she represented. Audiences did not go to see Sandra transform, they came to meet the reassuring image they had learned to expect. Gig, another release shortly after, cemented the beach girl template, youthful, bright, and non-threatening. Her persona had become an industrial identity, a predictable emotional anchor for audiences. Theaters were full, posters ubiquitous, and the public's association with innocence so deeply ingrained that any deviation risked her career. But the system that had protected her also imprisoned her. Roles demanded the same feeling, youthfulness became a requirement, and her body had to remain frozen in time while life moved forward. Marriage to Bobby Darin, which seemed like a personal escape, layered her schedule with additional pressures. Pregnancy, childbirth, and subsequent miscarriages occurred under the same relentless professional and public scrutiny. Medication and alcohol slowly became tools to cope, blurring the lines between survival and dependency. The trauma of her childhood never truly disappeared. Instead, it manifested in intimacy, relationships, and the way she related to her own body. Silence, endurance, and self-sacrifice had become habits. They now determined how she navigated adult life. Marital tensions were compounded by unresolved childhood wounds. Bobby, despite love and intent, could not fully understand the depth of her history. Their connection was real, but it was shaped by two sets of unhealed trauma intersecting in ways neither could completely navigate. Divorce, when it came, did not signify failure. It signaled that the psychological load had become too heavy. After Bobby's death at 37, Sandra's isolation deepened. Alcohol use increased, eating disorders worsened, and the quiet life she now led was dominated by the echoes of a career and childhood spent surviving within someone else's frame. Hollywood no longer demanded her presence, and the image that had once defined her could not protect her from herself. Roles faded, public appearances diminished, and silence became her new reality. In 1994, Sandra released Dream Lovers, a memoir not aimed at reviving her career but at reclaiming control over her own story. She spoke openly about abuse, eating disorders, alcoholism, and grief, elements of life that had never been permitted a public voice. The book did not erase her past, but it repositioned it, transforming years of invisible control into something tangible, something confronted. Sandra Dee's final years were marked by illness, weakness, and the long-term consequences of a life spent under relentless control. Kidney failure, exhaustion, and the cumulative toll of decades of survival left her physically diminished. She died in 2005, quietly, without the fanfare that once accompanied her presence in American culture. No television specials, no awards ceremonies, no public reflection marked her passing. The world had frozen her in time as the innocent girl, the ideal American teenager, but the real Sandra had lived a far more complex, painful, and courageous life. Her legacy is paradoxical. Sandra Dee remains in memory as an icon, a perfectly safe, controlled figure. Yet the woman behind the image endured years of silence, trauma, and pressure that few ever witnessed. She did not collapse in a single moment. She wore down slowly, through every role that demanded perfection, every meal carefully controlled, every loss endured without space to grieve. The tragedy was not that she became an icon. The tragedy was that she was never allowed to stop being one. Sandra Dee's story is not just the tale of a Hollywood star, it is the story of a child forced onto a stage too soon, and never given the room to step away and simply be human.